Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am joined today by my friend Rebekah Vickery. Rebekah, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Tell our listeners a little bit about where you are geographically and what you spend your time doing.
Yeah, I'm located in the Pacific Northwest. I'm a therapist. I primarily work with folks who are working through religious trauma. And I also work with the Allender Center, and I'm learning to call myself an artist. So that's been a new, exciting journey, and yeah, very interested to see where that will go. But
let's talk a little bit about story. How did you first get interested in story in general and your story in particular?
I have always been interested in story. I think there's some generational trauma in my family. And so even as a young child, I was really curious about trauma, curious about what makes people do the things they do or keep them from doing the things they're not doing. And I started reading very young. So I started reading books about attachment and relationships and Christian counseling when I was like 6 or 7. So it is not a shock to anyone in my family that I'm a therapist. As far as like my personal story work, that's been a lot longer of a process. Looking back, I can see like, oh, there's something that my body knew about my experiences and the way they had shaped me. And I can even see some of that interest that I had really being about trying to understand my own experience. But consciously, I was the person that said, like, I have a good childhood. And I really wrestled with that, particularly as I moved into adolescence, because I felt both simultaneously. I would often be up at night with a lot of panic attacks and anxiety and feeling like there's something wrong with me and I don't know what it is. And yet at the same time had this other experience that said like, well, I must not be seeing my reality correctly. That confusion was a pretty familiar experience. And then, at 19, I moved to work at a residential recovery program. It was originally an 8-week internship that turned into a year-long internship that turned into being on staff there for 5.5 years. And the program was based around the idea of healing in the context of a community. And so it was a year-long program, and the residents would come and they would live in these dorms for a year, and they saw counselors, and they also had some group work together, and then they would work. It was a working farm. And so the idea was you're getting healing in these spaces, but you're also experiencing healing and finding connection and relationship. One of the things that I noticed pretty early on was a lot of what these women are saying, I resonate with. And I felt a lot of desire to be a resident there. And I didn't know what to do with that desire because I was hearing these stories that were horrific. And yet that sense of like, well, I don't know if I can trust my own reality. So I don't know if I can trust that my experiences have been big enough or impactful enough for me to have the response that I'm having. And so I was pretty conflicted. And a couple years into my time there, we had just a series of events within the program that were difficult and ended up leading to having a licensed counselor come out and meet with the staff. Following that meeting, he went to the CEO and said, hey, if you're willing to help fund this, like I'm willing to meet with some of the staff individually for 10 sessions. And he had a list of names and my name was on them. So I started meeting with him, and that was really the start of a trajectory that has continued since. That was a little over a decade ago. And he was really the first person that put words to like, oh, you have a story. And that was both really validating, and that was the beginning of that trajectory. And I was there for several more years meeting with him and then eventually another individual. And at the same time being in this community environment where the staff, because we were all living on the property as well with the residents, we kind of internalized a lot of the work that they were doing just in how we related to one another. There was beautiful things about that, and there were really probably difficult or unhealthy things about that. But one of the pieces that came out of it was I had a lot of people who told me very honest things about how I was relating with them and how I was in relationship and what they saw in me that was unhealthy or really needing care. And that was very impactful to have people speaking really difficult things and yet not leaving me. We all lived on the property. We continued to spend time together. And I honestly think that experience probably saved my life at various points. That really set a foundation for beginning grad school and continuing my inner healing work here in Seattle.
I want to hear more about I'm not sure I could trust my own reality.
I can see there's these systemic realities that my family was in, and like some of our belief systems and ideologies that supported it, and then my own particular family of origin and the way that played out. And I think in a larger systemic sense, my family was part of, or we were loosely affiliated with, is probably a more honest way to say, like with the Quiverful movement, which is kind of a fringe of the purity culture, or maybe a little bit like evangelical purity culture carried out to its natural conclusion. So people within the Quiverful movement are anti-contraceptive, anti-family planning. They tend to have a patriarchal way of functioning within the family, and they're anti-state and oftentimes anti-church in the sense of like the family is where you work out salvation and holiness and all of those things. And so we would stay together. We didn't do youth group. We would stay together as a family in church environments. And so there's a big distrust of institutions. Because of that context and because of my family's interest in that, I read a lot of books around Quiverful theology. I read a lot of people that were in this movement. And so some of it was directly said from my family, and a lot of it I think I absorbed just from like what I was reading. But one of my big takeaways as a child immersed in that world was like my family, and particularly like my dad, although I think for me it was my dad and my mom, like they are the ones that carry the voice of the Lord. And so for me to have a different experience or to say I see things differently than my family felt like I'm going against the Lord. And that felt absolutely terrifying. And so I really had this experience of like, the Lord is really powerful and I'm really small. I can't ever speak anything against him. And the way that my family is structured is the way it is supposed to be. That was my like kind of child logic that really impacted how, as I started to also have these other experiences where I'm like, I think not all as well, felt very, very terrifying. And there's some and then within my family of origin itself, there's some narcissistic structures and ways of being that I often felt, and occasionally sometimes will still feel like, oh, I'm crazy. Like my reality is not real. There's something I'm not seeing correctly or not seeing well. And yet one of the biggest parts of my own healing journey has been like my body has held my story. And so even when there were chunks of my life where it's hard to have explicit memory or the memories I have, like I would question my own reality or my way of thinking about something, my body would shake or I would panic or my gut would know something. And so coming to understand and listen to my body and pay attention has been huge in my healing journey. And to trust like, oh, my body knows something. The loyalty and protectiveness that I've had towards my family continues to be there to some extent and probably always will be. And I think there's an aspect of that I can bless. But a lot of that loyalty has also now like been, it's also with me. Like I feel protective and tender and loyal towards my own self. And that was something that, I learned to do over time.
Okay, so I want to come back to this, my body holds my story. But first, let's just, for the benefit of the listeners who have no idea what you just said about quiverful, you're using a word, quiver, like a quiver of arrows, and full, like a full glass of water, quiverful. What does that mean?
It's based out of a verse in Psalm 127. I can't think of the exact But the verse is, "Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will defend his enemies at the gate." The quiverful movement, this person named Mary Pride in the 80s wrote a book called The Way Home. One of the pieces of that was she talked about the woman's place really being to return to the home and return to her calling as a wife and mother. And that's how the kingdom of God could be spread in the States. That's how we take back the United States for Christ. It came together really to a head in the late 80s, early 90s, where you have these different pieces of Christian nationalism, the religious right, that come together to say, oh, the way we're going to take back the culture for Christ is to have children and to raise a family that is godly. And if we follow this model, then the result will be this.
You're going to read one of your stories in a moment, but before we do that, let's just talk a little bit more about "my body holds my story." Because when I asked you about that phrase that you couldn't trust if your reality was real, like you started talking about how in your family, both your family of origin, but then the broader culture that your family was a part of, there was a sense in which authority, truth, was handed down to you external from you, Rebekah, as a girl, as an adolescent, as a young woman. Authority, truth was taught to you from someone outside of you.
Mm-hmm.
Then you shared about how but my body holds my story. So can you say a little bit more about that?
I think that sense of authority coming from outside of myself and being backed up with the way that scripture can be used to back that up as well. Like, your heart is deceitful above all things. Who can know it? That I was a very sensitive child. And so I wanted to please. And I felt very strongly about wanting to make sure that I was doing the things and believing the things that were going to make sure that I was kept safe. And because we were in a home that often talked about scripture, we talked about heaven, we talked about death, we talked about what it looked like to live a life of obedience. I took all of those things in a very concrete, childlike way to say, okay, if I'm not doing these things, then there's something wrong with me and I'm probably headed straight for hell. And so I had a lot of motivation to not trust these experiences that my body was having. The longer I have worked with people in the realm of trauma and the more that I have paid attention to my own story and the ways my own like young parts can't really activate different things, I've really learned to trust that like when I'm feeling anxious, that's information that my body is giving me about something. It may not be about what's happening in that moment. It might be something that's happening in that moment that's reminding me or reminding my nervous system of something in the past, but I can still trust that as information. My anger is okay. My anger is actually a good thing. It brings clarity. And to live a life of integrity is to name the truth. And that includes listening to the truth of what my body has experienced, because our nervous systems don't make meaning. Our prefrontal cortex and our cognitive brain makes meaning about what's happening. And I did, but my nervous system is just having the experience that it's having.
And when you say things like "my body holds my story" or "my nervous system is responding," I mean, just to be clear to everyone, what you're talking about is our bodies have sensations.
Yes.
In our guts, in our chest, in our throat. We have constriction, we have expansion, we have tightness, we have butterflies, we have sensations. And so when you're experiencing anxiety, that is first a physical sensation in parts of your body. And it differs from person to person, but that's what we're talking about, is the physical sensations that you experience in your physical body as you're living your life.
Yes. In beginning to, like, healing is not, it is understanding our story cognitively, being able to recognize, like, here are the themes that happened and healing is also a very embodied experience I remember when I had this, I've always had really dry hands. That was frustrating to me because lotion wouldn't really help. When I started learning more about how our body holds not just trauma, but all the experiences we've been through, I was remembering different periods of time in my life where particularly my right hand would be injured in different ways. But my hand is scarred and holds a lot of story. And so as an adult, I was living in New Hampshire for a time, and the winters are brutal there. And my left hand, when I would lotion it, would still be dry, but be okay. And my right hand, it didn't matter how much lotion I put on, it would still be really cracked. It would still be really dry. And so I started wondering about, like, how is my hand telling the story? I didn't like the way my hands looked. That was just one of the quirks in my body that I felt like, I could have chosen different hands for myself. But I started realizing, like, my hand doesn't actually know how I'm feeling about it cognitively. It just knows the experience of being pushed too far or the experience of being tended to. And so I started putting lotion on my hands every night and just saying, like, you're good, you're good, you're good, over and over again. I did that for a really long time. And I remember that being kind of this moment of insight for me of, like, my body only knows the experience. My prefrontal cortex in my brain, like, I make meaning of it. But my body only knows the experience. And that's another aspect of healing, is paying attention to, like, what is happening and how can I tend to it without judging, or trying to assume, like, I'm anxious because of this and I shouldn't be anxious, but, I feel really anxious. There's time for me to figure out why I'm anxious, but what am I needing in this moment to help bring some soothing to my nervous system?
It's a lovely reminder that our posture towards our stories, and particularly towards parts of our body, matters. And you in New Hampshire developed a new posture towards your right hand. And it was a posture of regular, repeated, nightly kindness and recognition of, there's something going on with my right hand, and I'm going to bless my right hand. And 10 years ago, if I had heard you say what you just said, like putting lotion on your right hand and saying you're good, I would have thought that was the biggest amount of psychobabble. And all I can say is it's true, and it works, and it matters. Blessing and cursing of parts of our body has efficacy in the spiritual realm. It just does. And you had a posture of blessing towards, we could say, the neediness of your right hand. So you have generously offered to read a story from when you were 6 years old in your family. Would now be an okay time to do that?
Yeah. It's the winter that my mom was sick. It's a little after lunch, and everyone is sleeping except me. I'm curled up reading on my toddler bed that at 6 years old is too small for me. I've learned to sleep curled up in a ball. Dad comes to the door, and he whispers for me to join him. He's laid out the PB&J on the counter, and he tells me to make sandwiches for dinner. He says I can put them back in the bag and store it in the fridge until then. He's pulled up the step stool to the counter. I climb up and I start counting out the pieces. 2 a person for the 5 of us kids. All of us, not including the 3-month-old, who's with my mom. Dad tussles my hair and leaves for the nursing home, where he'll work till midnight. I lick the knife covered in peanut butter, even though I'm not supposed to, but then I feel guilty, and I quickly ask Jesus to forgive me. When the sandwiches are done, I go to each bedroom, and I drag out the laundry hampers, lining them up in the hallway by the machine. The 2-year-old wakes up from her nap crying for me. She's in the middle of potty training, and in the middle of most nights, I wake up with her. On the nights when my dad hears us, he rewards us both with a chocolate chip, enough incentive for me to keep motivating myself out of bed. This afternoon, she helps me bring the sheets to the laundry machine to be added to the current load, and I wipe the plastic mattress down and I spread baking soda on it. The 1-year-old has woken up with a dirty diaper. I get the switch and I lay it beside her on the floor, along with a fresh diaper. It's my job to discipline them. At 5, we eat dinner. I cut the little one's sandwiches into pieces and I pour frozen peas on our plates. After dinner, while the babies play, the two oldest of us wash the dishes, and the middle sister sweeps the floor. The broom is taller than she is. I go after her, and I clean up the spots that she missed. I give baths to the little ones, cupping their foreheads to protect their eyes from the baby shampoo. They always refuse to go to bed until I tuck them in. So I snuggle down with them and I read books until their eyes are droopy, and then I kiss their foreheads and I tiptoe out. The middle two listen to me, telling them to go to their room as well. The quiet night after everyone is in bed is one of my favorite times of the day. I pick up the toys and I put the last load of clothes in the dryer. I put on a cassette tape of someone reading scripture, and later I will tuck myself completely under my blankets, making sure not even a strand of hair is out. Listening to his deep, steady voice is usually the only way that I can fall asleep without panic.
Thank you, Rebekah. Is it okay if we go back through your story and look at it together? There's the peanut butter licking part at the beginning where you say you felt guilt, but then you quickly asked Jesus to forgive you. So at age 6, I mean, you're licking peanut butter off a knife. I get it. It's wrong. But you have high levels of guilt at age 6. And you seem to really care about Jesus as a 6-year-old. What do you make of that second part, this 6-year-old's love for Jesus?
Such a tender question. My family was a Christian family, so I was very aware of Jesus. And he was somebody that felt very comforting to me. Jesus was somebody that was very consistent to me and steady and didn't need anything from me. And so I felt very safe. At the same time, I felt that in order to maintain that connection, or in order to make sure that I could continue to be loved, I needed to make sure that I was not doing too much or not being a burden or doing the right thing. So there was a lot of guilt and shame wrapped up all in that. And a lot of, even at that age, like a lot of questions I had about the goodness of God and what it meant to believe in something that wasn't necessarily happening, because, I mean, just developmentally, I was thinking so concretely. We were going to churches that were on the more Pentecostal side and talked about healing, like physical healing, miracles. I saw that happen to people. And yet here I was in this environment where my mom was unwell. I felt overwhelmed. And so it didn't make sense in my mind that if that's true, then why isn't it happening here? So I already had a lot of kind of existential angst at 6. And that all went into looking at peanut butter and then being like, oh, what have I done?
I understand the guilt, the high levels of guilt, but you also, as a 6-year-old, had a very genuine love for Jesus.
Yes, I did. There was something that I needed in that connection and like attunement.
Well, you already named it. You said he didn't need anything from you, and he was steady. He didn't require anything from this 6-year-old.
No, he was somebody that I could just was always with me, and I could always talk to about anything. He was somebody when I was scared that I felt like I could tell him I was scared, and that would be okay. That was not something that I felt from my parents that I could receive. I truly didn't have spaces that I felt like, oh, I can be scared. It's okay to be scared. And yet I was, of course, terrified.
And one of the reasons that your 6-year-old body has so much fear is because you have quite a few siblings that their life is dependent on your care. And so is it fair to say, Rebekah, that the reason you are a mother in this particular story is not merely because your mother is sick?
Right. At that point in my life, I would never have said I was an orphan. I mean, I think 5 years ago, I wouldn't have said I was an orphan. And I still wouldn't say I am in the literal sense, but can see those young parts of me that were so orphaned. So there's a response in myself to in an attempt to mother myself, also tend to other young young ones. And that, of course, like has continued to play out in my work as a therapist. And I remember how like devastating it was for me probably, I don't know, 10 or 11 years ago to realize, oh, my motives aren't pure. Like I'm doing this work because I'm trying to tend to my own young selves. I wanted to believe that I helped people, that I wanted to help people, that I cared for my siblings because I was this life-giving, genuine, kind person. And to face the reality of like, sure, there's truth to that. And the deeper truth is that I'm trying to meet unmet needs in myself, is to face the truth of what it was to be an orphan. And that was a truth that was, to name that, I knew, like my body knew, like that would come at a cost that I would never be able to reverse. You can't unknow a truth.
You have a sentence in here that I just want to read and comment on. The quiet night after everyone is in bed is one of my favorite times of the day. When I read that sentence, when I read your story, I mean, that's every young mother's sentence. Every young mother's sentence. You know, the kids are in bed and she gets to like breathe. But you're 6. You're not 36. At that point in the story, what you do is you clean up, you know, you do what young mothers do. And then you write this: later, I will tuck myself completely under the blankets, making sure not even a strand of hair is out. Now we're getting to the truth of the day. Now, all of a sudden, you're 6 again. And this little 6-year-old is afraid. And she's learning how to bring containment to her deeply dysregulated 6-year-old body. Curl up in a ball and like tuck every single part of you under the blankets. What's it like for you as I'm saying this? What's happening in your body?
Well, I felt myself take a breath when you said like, oh, she was 6 again. There's something about hearing it in those words where I was like, yeah, that is what happened. I did return to being 6. I don't know that I have put it in those words before. Yeah, what's happening in my body in this moment is a protectiveness for her, a protectiveness for that child that was so in need of containment and regulation that she had to be completely, like I needed to be completely underneath the blanket. I remember that being so important. Like I needed to feel like I could be secure. Seeing that now, like I see it, oh, there's so, like I was looking for ways to regulate my nervous system. I was looking for ways to like bring containment to a lot of overwhelm. So I feel that. I feel a lot of tenderness towards her in that. Yeah, I do feel some anger on her behalf. In this particular story, I feel more sadness. Like I would, if I had to give it a genre, I'd say it feels more of a tragedy. Oh, there are so many people in the story who are suffering, and who's tending to this one that's suffering.
Right. That's right. And the answer to that question is the man reading the scripture that you're listening to. You put on a cassette tape of someone reading scripture, and the last line of your story is listening to his deep, steady voice is the only way that I can fall asleep without panic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the tapes were 30 minutes long on each side, but I remember like I would start to feel anxiety build as I knew that side of the cassette was coming to an end, because I would have to turn it over, and to leave my bed and go out into the living room and turn the tape over felt really terrifying to me. And so I would feel that anxiety build, and then I would kind of talk myself up into turning it over. So I would like run as fast as I could out to the living room, flip it over and run as fast as I could back to bed. And then I would feel this complete sense of like rest in my body as soon as he began talking. And so there was something I think about just the deepness of his voice that felt very soothing on a like physical level. But it also was that was the connection I had. That was the attachment I had to help soothe my overwhelm.
And he wasn't reading the Declaration of Independence. He was reading the Bible.
Right.
And that grounded you.
That grounded me. Yeah, that grounded me. Yeah, and the story of the woman who bled for 12 years and then came and touched the hem of Jesus's garment always made me cry. Like I cried every time I listened to it.
Do you know why?
As an adult now, I can see like, oh, there's so much desire and like need and longing that I had. But as a child, I didn't know why. I just knew there was something in that story that stirred in me like this, oh, I wish that I could do that.
Uh-huh. You were bleeding out every day of your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I was.
And like the woman with the issue of blood in that story, you were alone to contain it. And at some level, you were unclean.
Yes. I had a recurring dream. In this dream, I had this disease that was transmitted through human touch. And so I had to stay in this like plastic cage. And I knew I was sometimes dying, sometimes just unwell, but nobody could come near me. No one could touch me. They would, I think for my dream, like that was a way of kind of holding the like the truth of what my body felt. And I say all that and knowing like there were times where I received attention and care, and that actually added to the confusion. In some ways, it would be easier to say like, oh, this was all bad, right? But it wasn't. Like I never doubted that my parents loved me. I still don't doubt that. And I never doubted that they wanted good things for me. And yet my reality, right, was so much, and I don't use this word lightly, but it was so much neglect in many different ways. I knew sooner that it was because of all these other pieces. It took me a long time to know, oh, and it still has an impact on me. The intent can be there and the impact can still be devastating, even if the intent is for good. And how is it that I have come to be, as a child, right, carrying the responsibility for the intent? That I think has been a kind of this like orienting question of like, how did I come to bear all of the responsibility for the relationship, for my own care and need?
Any sense of the answer to that excellent question?
It was how I knew I mean, of course I didn't think about it in these exact words, but it was how I was going to survive. Like I think about like the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. Like I froze and I fawn, right? Like I moved towards the harm because it felt like if I can make this better, if I can make sure that like I know that caring for me feels like a burden, and if I can ease that burden, right, then I'm secured love, I'm secured connection. I can like be in this family and I can provide that for those who are younger than me. So it was a response to threat.
And just to be clear, this is not a compliment, but as a 6-year-old, you were a very good mother.
I was.
And your parents knew that.
Yes.
And your father in particular benefited immensely from that.
Yes, he did.
But at immense cost to the 6-year-old's heart and the 8-year-old's heart and the 10-year-old's heart.
Yeah, there was a long period of time where I could not name that deeper truth because I know I haven't really gone into the reasons for this time period or others, but there's so many complexities that led to it. And I saw them. And so I thought, well, there's no other option here. And yet, right, of course there were other options. And it took me a long time to recognize like, oh no, there was something about the idealization of me, right? The triangulation that's there, the way that I could fill this role and I could fill it well. And yet nobody was stepping in and saying, oh, but that's not a role you should have to fill, right? You are little, right? It's okay to be little. And that was a much harder truth to name.
Yeah. And to say it a little bit differently, it's okay to have needs.
Yes. Right.
You were never allowed to have needs.
No. And that's the crazy making. And I'm guessing like there will be people listening who can resonate with this, right? That's the crazy making piece of it, right? Because neither of my parents sat me down and said, you're not allowed to have needs. Right. And I actually don't even think that they cognitively thought that. But the impact, the action said, of course I wasn't allowed to have needs. Because if I had needs, no one was going to be there to tend to all of the other needs that are around me.
So, Rebekah, before I let you go, thank you. And also, one last question for you, and you're relatively young and incredibly mature for your age, but how has your posture towards this 6-year-old changed even over the past 5 years?
I remember my first year of, actually, it was my first semester of grad school. We were in this like practicum experiential counseling course. And one of the faculty and I had a meeting. He was the first man that I had ever seen cry for me when I told him something of my story that I didn't actually, at the time, didn't really think it was that big of a deal because I knew I had other stories that were harder, and he cried. That was so impactful to me to see. My story impacts other people. And there have been many like other healers and people who have walked with me since then. And I'm so deeply grateful. And before that, there were people too. And I don't think I would have been able to bear his tears if I hadn't already had years of trying to even build that safety enough to like sit with someone else who was crying for me. I needed someone to take me seriously to begin to start taking myself seriously.
What I'm hearing you say is that one way your posture towards the 6-year-old has changed is that you take her more seriously now than you used to.
I take her more seriously, and I approach her with curiosity, or I try to approach her with curiosity rather than judgment, and noticing what she needs versus criticizing or turning away from what she needs. Learning how to be with her in a way that allows her to be 6 and still be 6 now.
So good. Rebekah, thank you for your courage and your vulnerability in coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, inviting me, and yeah, it feels like an honor to share part of my story, part of her story.
If people want to contact you, work with you, find out more about you, where can they go to do that?
Yeah, they can find me at my website. It's Heart, as in HEART, and then a little dash, and then root, so heartroot.com. Or they can just Google Heartroot psychotherapy and it should show up that way as well. I have a private practice. I also do lead some groups for people who are in different kinds of life transitions that need to be marked or grieved, that maybe our culture doesn't have like rituals to do that. So that's been really rich. And yeah, you can find me there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rebekah.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.